Hello gamers, how are you today? I hope you're enjoying some warmer weather after the polar vortex has washed through most of the United States and done its job quite well at chilling down everyone. Here it is a nice, probably low 60s. Thank you, Texas. One of the few advantages of Texas that we do find from time to time is that it does tend to get a little bit of warm weather now and then. It gets much worse in the summer when the warmth is not something you really want anymore, and it's pushing 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this time I wanted to talk about the tabletop role-playing game Dungeon World. In this case, this book right here. It's fairly thick, but that's partly due to the layout. Single page, I guess not quite 8x6 book. Maybe it's 8x6. It seemed a little large for 8x6 to me, but I'm not going to get a ruler and measure it just to be sure. Now, when Dungeon World first came out, I was one of the people who was unsure of adopting it, mostly because, in my experience, the world games that I've seen carry too much baggage with them. That's not to say they all do, or to say that that baggage is necessarily a bad thing for the kinds of games some people want. Most notably, in this case, the baggage I mean is the sex moves of Apocalypse World proper. Now, I don't like a role-playing game that mandates certain actions or reactions on a mechanical level, and most of those are things like relationships. I don't mind a little bit of social mechanic support for what characters do or what they get onto in their interactions, but I don't want it to be something that has very highly structured format. And part of that is because, in my experience, no structure is ever going to survive 100% sufficiently workability when it encounters a player character. And that is made worse when you start dealing in delicate subjects such as sex and relationships in role-playing games. Now, I have had games that have touched on the topics of sex and sexuality from time to time, and I've had characters who've had kids over the years because, of course, sex, relationships, etc. lead to those kinds of things quite often. Not always, but sometimes. And basically, that kept me from adopting Dungeon World. Now, Dungeon World doesn't have those highly structured elements applied to those specific things. Instead, its highly structured elements are applied to your traditional dungeon crawl. Although it does add a few twists that I feel are actually really useful, such as bonds. Bonds are your relationships to the other player characters. And if you've ever read any fantasy fiction which deals with basically your traditional fantasy party kind of thing, one of the things you're going to get out of that novel, if it's any good, is the relationships and the complexities of the character interactions. Even when they're sometimes the bad guys in a story. For example, one of my favorite little humorous series is the Goblin Hero series, Goblin Quest, Goblin Hero, Goblin War, written by Jim C. Hines. And they have an adventuring party in it, in the first one, that are basically, from the point of view of the main character, bad, because he's a goblin. But they are not the most pleasant people, even if they weren't adventurers. They're just altogether terrible human beings. Not even what I would consider a fun adventuring party, because they're kind of assholes. So excuse the language. But what it boils down to is that this game adds that element in such a way that it creates an interesting and personal connection between the player characters and why they're together, what things will happen when they're together, and how they can interact. Now, to be fair, the bond system is not necessarily restricted to just the player characters. In fact, from actually playing the game, I realized that creating bonds with locations, I was playing a druid, or bonds with NPCs would be a very interesting and functional aspect to add to play, because particularly we were traveling along a boat and some things happened on the boat that dealt with this sunken haunted haunted city. And that haunted city affected some of the people who were on the boat with us, so the boat crew. And my character was a druid, kind of considered himself a protector of the land, and saw those people as part of the land, and so therefore a bond that he had with them was important, kind of protecting them. And that added some interesting elements in play. Now, I have not yet run Dungeon World. My players vary in what they want to play from time to time. I have different play groups, and sometimes they're interested in superheroes, and sometimes they're interested in fantasy, and they're interested in different kinds of fantasy from time to time than traditional dungeon crawling style fantasy. At the moment, I don't have any kind of dungeon crawl game going. No Dungeon World based ones especially have happened yet, but they will, because I really am enamored of the mechanics. Now, what makes the mechanics interesting is fundamentally it's 2d6 plus stat modifier. I don't completely understand, except for one situation, why they kept the traditional 3 to 18 D&D stats, other than familiarity, which may be the reason. But because the modifiers are the most important part of play, whether they're positive, negative, or neutral, impacts your character's rolls. And your rolls are sort of mandated as a certain set of results that are generated for each of the character's moves, for the actions they take. Now, some people have trouble with the strictness of a move. I, on the other hand, actually find the fact that you're giving me a very specific rule for a very specific set of situations a very functional sort of way to handle play. Unlike having a universal mechanic where this mechanic always applies and always does X, Y, or Z, it gives you a somewhat universal mechanic that gives you specific result X, Y, and Z. So it gives you a specific field of those kinds of things. Like this move provides this kind of information. And so that's when you apply it, is when the person is asking for that kind of information. And it actually works fairly well because it gives you a fairly solid and somewhat rigid core to hang off all these other little amorphous elements of dungeon crawling that make it fun and interesting. As opposed to having a very set of complicated mechanics that don't always answer the questions of what would a person get out of this role. Dungeons & Dragons is the typical one here, where you have a huge, like in 3rd edition, you have a huge list of skills, and it doesn't always, not all of them, detail what kind of information the skill can be used for. Now, that's good and bad, because sometimes player characters will think of creative uses of skills and abilities that the writers didn't think of, the GM didn't think of, and he'll have to, figure out how to apply it. Dungeon World, on the other hand, has given you a very specific, this is what applies. And it works. It works very well because it's not so rigid that you don't have an answer. Instead, it's just rigid enough that you will always know what kind of answers you can give a player character from their roles. But you can still apply that as strictly or rigidly or not so much as you like as any role-playing game. Now, there are some things that I find are problematic in Dungeon World, and nothing terrible. Again, it's part of this problem that it evolved from D&D, and D&D style gaming has to do with the kind of magic that's default, which is fairly strict spell lists. While I don't mind spell lists in some games, I prefer a little more freeform magic, and that has been addressed, of course, in various playbooks that people have created. Now, that's kind of the whole interesting thing about the world games are the playbooks. The playbooks are basically mini expansions that allow you to add single elements at a time to the game. New classes, alternate class takes, new races, whatever. They're sort of micro supplements that a person can probably cook up one in a matter of a day or two. Nothing really complicated without having to make a huge list of house rules or changes to the base core mechanics. Now, some of the things that I find interesting about the game is that the moves are never directly applied in game speak. In fact, they tell you describe your character's actions as you would describe your character's actions in any other game. Describe them. What is your character doing? What are they taking? Are they climbing a rock? Are they, Ask them what they're doing. Get them to tell you as detailed as likely, and then you pick a move that applies and ask for a roll based on that move. They're not supposed to name it. They're not supposed to basically refer to it, because that's a metagame consideration that does not actually matter to the in-game perspective of play. Now, overall, I give a Dungeon World a high recommendation, especially if you're looking for an alternative to D&D style fantasy that is simple and solid, without basically trying to press games that probably shouldn't be used for that kind of gaming, and pressing them into a service. In general, it's an impressive little tome. The playbooks that I've seen so far, the print ones that I got with this particular copy, are nice. I originally bought it in PDF and later picked this up from somebody online as a purchase, since they apparently weren't using it. But it's a nice little tome. Functional, useful. I enjoy the gameplay it gives a lot. I enjoy how moves can be applied so that I can interfere in other characters' actions. Not necessarily saying, oh no, don't let this other player character do something, but allowing me to jump in and defend another player character, mechanically applied. Whereas a lot of games don't think about the fact that your player character might want to protect their friend that they're adventuring with. And it let me take damage for another character when they were already hurt or when something else has happened. One of the nice things I like about Dungeon World as well is the partial success mechanic, in that there's a range in which you fail, a range in which you get a success, but you have to take some kind of setback. Now, anyone who's familiar with my own games will probably notice that in High Valor, this occurs only on a tie. In High Valor, if you get a tie, you can take a setback to push the success that you want forward. Of course, you're going to suffer a little bit for it, because you have to take that setback. This game has something similar based on your die roll, and it works very well. I like that aspect because it can create some dramatic, intense moments. In the case of the game I played in, our thief was fighting some sort of cultist on a rooftop, and he swept the cultist's legs out from under him, but didn't get quite high enough of a success. He didn't get a full success. So instead, the cultist began to slip off the roof and grabbed his leg and dragged him after the cultist, dragged the thief after the cultist. And this is very much an exciting and gameable moment that twisted traditional, what I consider dungeon crawling style play, because it makes you make choices, concessions, and gives you some drama. And I like drama in games, not just fighting the monster drama, but drama where it's tense, where the characters don't know if they're going to survive, and it's not just a save or die situation. And that this game is mostly blessedly free of such kind of problems as early D&D had with the save or die phenomena. Now, that's about it for this time. It's running long, and I'm going to cut it short right here. I hope you have an enjoyable weekend, what's left of it, and good gaming.